Hello, everyone. So today we are going to be preparing for our Civil Rights versus Voting Rights Act discussion prep. The directions for today are to read the following text with your partner. As you read, record three pieces of evidence that support one of the following claims. The claims are the Civil Rights Act was the most important legislation to result from the Civil Rights era, or the Voting Rights Act was the most important legislation to result from the Civil Rights era. Fine, I'll do it. When done, you will work in groups to share your evidence and argue your case. So I'm going to start right here. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Each year from 1945 until 1957, Congress considered and failed to pass a civil rights bill. Congress finally passed limited civil rights acts in 1957 and 1960. They both offered only moderate gains. As a result, the United States Commission on Civil Rights was formed to investigate, report on, and make recommendations to the President concerning civil rights issues. During this period, there were many sit-ins, boycotts, and freedom rides as African Americans demanded inclusion in the political process. 1963 was a crucial year for the civil rights movement. Social pressures continued to build with events such as the Birmingham Campaign, televised clashes between peaceful protesters and authorities, the murder of civil rights workers Medgar Evers and William L. Moore, the March on Washington, and the deaths of four young girls in the bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church. There was no turning back. Civil rights were firmly on the national agenda, and the federal government was forced to respond. In response to the report of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, President John F. Kennedy proposed in a nationally televised address a Civil Rights Act of 1963. A week after his speech, Kennedy submitted a bill to Congress addressing civil rights. He urged African American leaders to use caution when demonstrating, since new violence might alarm potential supporters. Kennedy met with businessmen, religious leaders, labor officials, and other groups such as CORE and the NAACP, while also maneuvering behind the scenes to build bipartisan support and negotiate compromises over controversial topics. Following Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, both Martin Luther King Jr. and newly inaugurated President Lyndon B. Johnson continued to press for passage of the bill. As King noted in a January 1964 newspaper column, legislation will feel the intense focus of Negro interest. It became the order of the day at the Great March on Washington last summer. The Negro and his white compatriots for self-respect and human dignity will not be denied. Within hours of his passage of the Civil Rights Act on July 2, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson, with Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Height, Roy Wilkins, John Lewis, and other civil rights leaders in attendance, signed the bill into law, declaring once and for all that the discrimination for any reason on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin was illegal in the United States. I'm going to read that sentence again, starting from the very beginning. Within hours of its passage of the Civil Rights Act on July 2, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson, with Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Height, Roy Wilkins, John Lewis, and other civil rights leaders in attendance, signed the bill into law, declaring once and for all that discrimination for any reason on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin was illegal in the United States. If you need to, feel free to pause to take notes. Otherwise, I'm going to keep reading. Violence at Selma in 1965. At the invitation of the Improvement Association, King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, chose Selma, Alabama, as a focus for civil rights demonstrations in 1964. The mayor of Selma, along with the chief of police, kept the government response mild. The mayor did not want the bad publicity that violent confrontations between demonstrators and law enforcement officials would bring. Selma's sheriff, Jim Clark, infamous for leading a band of thuggish irregulars in the oppression of blacks, had told the mayor he would not involve himself in the demonstrations in Selma. However, demonstrations in the town of Marion, 25 miles southwest of Selma, were another matter. Civil rights organizers there, discouraged by their lack of progress in getting county officials to register black voters, requested help from the SCLC. After an emotional night rally at a Marion church, SCLC staffers led an impromptu march to the Marion courthouse just a few blocks away. The marchers were met by a force of 200, made up of state troopers, county deputy sheriffs, local policemen, civilians, and Sheriff Jim Clark. With national and local journalists looking on, the marchers were ordered to disperse. Then, the law enforcement officials and irregulars charged the crowd. Demonstrators and journalists were beaten and terrorized. One demonstrator, Jimmy Lee Jackson, who had entered a cafe with his mother to escape the violence, was shot by police. He died a week later. The idea of a march from Selma came from the desire to go to Montgomery with Jimmy Jackson, take his body, and lay it on the steps of the Capitol, said Marion civil rights organizer Albert Turner. The SCLC planned a march to Montgomery for Sunday, March 7th, 1965. George Wallace swore to stop it. That Sunday, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge near Selma, the marchers encountered a cordon of state troopers backed by Sheriff Jim Clark and a group of horsemen armed with clubs and whips. The resulting bloodshed was a public relations disaster for Wallace. National television news crews captured footage of the marchers being ferociously clubbed, whipped, and tear gassed. In Washington, Congress, congressmen and women of both parties voiced support for legislation with the power to stop the violence and guarantee voting rights for all citizens in places like Selma. President Johnson would soon submit the Voting Rights Act, which would be signed into law in August. On March 18, 1965, a federal district judge, Wallace's college friend Frank Johnson, sanctioned a second protest march from Selma to Montgomery. Alabamians were indignant at yet another intrusion of the federal government into local affairs. Wallace refused to spend any state funds on providing protection for the demonstrators, sending his approval ratings in his home state soaring. President Johnson countered by federalizing the Alabama National Guard. At the conclusion of the march, King addressed the 25,000 demonstrators. King said during his speech, "I know you are asking today, how long will it take? How long? Not long, because you still reap what you sow." Again, if you need to, feel free to pause so you can take notes on the section that we just read. Otherwise, I'm going to continue with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act was passed by the United States Congress in 1965. In 1957 and 1960, Congress had passed laws to protect the rights of black voters, and the 24th Amendment in 1964 banned the use of poll taxes in federal elections. Nevertheless, in the presidential elections of 1964, blacks continued to have difficulty registering to vote in many areas. Voter registration drives met with bitter and sometimes violent opposition. In March 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. led a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to dramatize the voting issue. Immediately after the march, President Lyndon B. Johnson sent a voting rights bill to Congress, and it was quickly passed. The Voting Rights Act authorized the United States Attorney General to send federal examiners to register black voters under certain circumstances. It also suspended all literacy tests in states in which less than 50% of the voting age population had been registered or had voted in the 1964 election. The law had an immediate impact. By the end of 1965, 250,000 new black voters had been registered. That is 250,000 new black voters, one third by the federal examiners. The Voting Rights Act was readopted and strengthened in 1970, 1975, and 1982. Now that you have finished reading, work with your partner to complete the attached graphic organizer to prepare for your small group conversations and the full class discussion. Here are the directions. Using the document above, find the pieces of evidence that support your claim. Team A will do the following. Team A will present their argument and evidence. Team B will record the evidence that Team A shares, and then will restate Team A's evidence. Next, Team B will present their argument and evidence. While they're doing that, Team A will record and restate Team B's evidence. At the end, both teams will work together to build a consensus. Consensus is basically oops. Consensus is basically working together to get on the same page. So, even though both of you have presented different arguments, take a second to see which argument the four of you believe is the strongest. It can be from Team A, it could be from Team B, or it could be a combination of both. Together, your group will develop that consensus statement about whether the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act is the most important piece of legislation to form, let me change that, form out of the Civil Rights era. If you have any questions, feel free to ask the teacher.